Thanks, everybody. Hi, I'm Kevin Bixby, the director of Wildlife for All. And this is a brief presentation of an issue that I wrote about for Truthout in July about the growing influence of the gun lobby in wildlife affairs. And I'm sure all of you know that state wildlife management tends to prioritize the interests of consumptive users of wildlife, hunters, anglers, and trappers. Well, what's happened in the last couple decades is that another user has emerged as a power player in wildlife governance, and that is the gun lobby, gun industry, and gun rights groups. So it all has to do with this federal law called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, better known as Pittman-Robertson, which was passed in 1937. It redirected an existing tax on firearms to states for wildlife restoration and hunter education. It was a good deal for the gun industry because it took an existing tax that disappeared into the federal treasury and converted it into essentially an investment in new gun users, in other words, hunters. It's become an important source of funding for state wildlife agencies. It accounts for, on average, about 15% of agency revenues. That's across all states. The figure is much higher in some states that have less of a diversity of funding sources, like my state of New Mexico. Pittman-Robertson accounts for about a third of the agency's budget. And it's significant money. 1.1 billion was apportioned to the states and territories in fiscal year 2022, which was a new high. So Pittman-Robertson is often referred to as part of a user pay model of funding for wildlife management, in which the users of wildlife shoulder the financial burden of paying for its production. And at the time, 1937, taxing firearms to produce more game animals to benefit hunters under a user pays model kind of made sense. It was assumed that most gun owners were hunters, and hunters were seen as the main users of wildlife. Pittman-Robertson has played a significant role in creating the privileged position that consumptive users, hunters, have in wildlife management today. It's done this in several ways. It's elevated hunters as users under the user pay model, since they were the primary buyers of guns and bullets at the time. And they were also the ones who bought the hunting licenses that have been the main source of required state matching funds for Pittman-Robertson. In addition, the law itself created incentives for the states to sell more hunting licenses in two ways. First, the formula by which Pittman-Robertson funds are allocated to the states is based in part on the number of hunting licenses sold in a state. So the more hunting licenses sold, the more Pittman-Robertson funding is potentially available to that state. It also required that states enact laws to prohibit the diversion of hunting license fees away from the state wildlife agency. So now the agencies had a protected source of revenue. And bottom line is, the more licenses that were sold, the more money the state wildlife agency got, either directly through license fees or in the ability to leverage Pittman-Robertson funds. Not surprisingly, most Pittman-Robertson funded projects tend to benefit hunters. They're mostly used for projects that are intended to boost game species, including predator management. They're used for hunter recruitment, hunter education, and to build and operate shooting ranges. But the user pay model has been disrupted by a decades-long decline in the number of hunters in the United States, which has reduced the importance of hunters as a user in this model. You can see in 1960, 8% of the US population hunted, and that was almost halved by 2020. At the same time, gun sales have exploded. You can see the orange line in this chart. That's the amount of Pittman-Robertson revenues by year. It just keeps going up. It really took off after the end of the federal ban on assault weapons in 2004 and the election of Obama as president in 2008. And literally, Pittman-Robertson revenues are now off the chart because in 2022, as I said, they were 1.1 billion. There are now more guns in the United States than people, and most guns and ammunition that are purchased today are not purchased for the purpose of hunting. About 74% of guns and ammunition are not purchased for hunting. And that includes most of the most popular types of guns, handguns and AR-15 type semi-assault weapons. So as this model has been upended, rather than scrapping it, Congress decided to tweak it in 2019 by redefining who the user was in this user pay model. The act which passed added the terms recreational shooting and recreational shooter to the text of the law. It allowed for the first time Pittman-Robertson funds to be used to promote and market hunting and recreational shooting. And it set aside $5 million a year for these multi-state grants for to states and nonprofits for what's called R3 programs. And these are programs to recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters, basically to recruit more hunters. Now, notice that it can also go not just to states, but to NGOs. And one of those NGOs is the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Now, you may not have heard of this group, but it bills itself as the trade association of the firearms industry. And just in 2 years, I haven't seen 2022, but in 2 years, 2020, 21, they've received 5 grants, almost $900,000 for things like, converting the new firearm owners into active hunter and target shooters, and et cetera. NSSF is not new to R3 efforts. They've been doing it for years, and these are some screenshots from their website. You can read there. It says that NSSF has been working to increase participation in hunting, target shooting, and gun ownership for many years, and they have spent millions on R3 efforts, including down there at the bottom in the middle, efforts to persuade kids who like to shoot guns to switch to live targets, namely predators. So all of these changes I talked about, decline in hunters, the rise in non-hunting gun buyers, modernizing Pittman-Robertson Act, and especially the unwillingness of state wildlife agencies and their allies to give up the user pay model of funding, has opened the door for the gun lobby to gain power in wildlife matters. And increasingly, there's this conflation of interest between the hunting groups and the gun lobby, and they essentially share a goal of maximizing opportunities for hunting and firearm use, which, to put another way, is they share the goal of blocking efforts to limit hunting and shooting opportunities. And you see more and more this interlocking leadership where the leadership, members of the board or staff of the gun groups will serve on hunting groups and vice versa. And just going back to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, they are represented on a number of organizations, either on the board or among the membership, including they're on the board of the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, which is an influential, very pro-hunting organization. They're on the board of the Council to Advance Hunting and the Shooting Sports, which is a R3 group that was formed to promote these R3 programs. They're a contributing member of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. They are a member of the American Wildlife Conservation Partners, and they're a national associate of another very pro-hunting group, the Sportsmen's Alliance. And that's just a sampling. There are other examples I could have given. So of course, the gun groups like NSF are happy to take credit for wildlife conservation. You can see here from the website how wildlife is thriving because of guns and hunting, and how sportsmen, sportswomen, and industry help save wildlife species. And I think the reason we see this is that it's a much better public relations position than simply being known as merchants of instruments of death, mayhem, and violence. And the establishment in state wildlife management is happy to play along and welcome the gun industry into the inner circle of wildlife governance. This article came out last Sunday. It's about the Arkansas State Game and Fish Commission's proposal to build a new shooting range with Pittman-Robertson funding. And this is a quote from the director of the Game and Fish Commission. "Every shooter is a conservationist, whether they know it or not, by virtue of their contributions to Pittman-Robertson." And I think that 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, the quote would have been "every hunter is a conservationist," but now shooters are in the mix. So how does this play out? How does this alignment of interest between the gun lobby, the hunting groups, and state wildlife agencies play out? And I don't think it's good for wildlife. These are a partial list of policy issues on which the hunting and gun lobbies have coalesced around an anti-conservation position. They oppose Endangered Species Act protections for wolves. They oppose bans on lead ammunition. They oppose efforts to ban killing contests. They support expansion of hunting on national wildlife refuges. And of course, they support efforts to recruit more hunters and shooters, i.e. gun buyers. And I think this will continue. I think these are powerful interests of the gun and hunting lobbies. They're now working together. And it all goes back to the funding. And I just want to make one point that since modernizing Pittman-Robertson was passed, at a time of record levels of gun violence in the United States, federal money is now available to groups like NSSF to promote gun ownership and gun use. I just think that's just crazy. So if you take away the importance of Pittman-Robertson as a source of funding for state wildlife agencies, I think these groups would lose a lot of power. And so what I personally think is a better way to fund wildlife conservation is to take guns out of the picture entirely and get rid of the whole idea of a user pay model. I mean, talking about a user pay model for how we maintain a public good just makes no sense to me. Wildlife is a public trust. We all benefit from wildlife. I think we should all pay for it. The idea that one user, whether it's hunters or gun owners, gets privileged say in how that public good is protected and managed makes no sense to me, just because they are perceived to be contribute more financially. I think we should find new sources of broad-based funding to support wildlife protection. As flawed as RAWA is, I think that's one possible source. And I think that we should redirect Pittman-Robertson funds, which are, I think, the only federal tax on guns and ammunition in the United States. We should redirect those funds to address gun violence, much like we do with other sin taxes that are used to, at least in part, to mitigate the harm caused by those items that we tax. And that's my presentation. Thank you. I'd love to answer questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, there's a lot to think about. Does anyone have a question or a comment